What is up, guys? Welcome to part 10 of the Expert Exploit series. The topic of this video is HUD Rundown. We're going to be having a look at the HUD. In particular, we'll be looking at my HUD, which I refer to as the Death Star HUD. And we're going to be talking about how to use the HUD. In particular, we're going to be looking at the hand-to-note software and how to access all the HUD features through that software. We're also going to talk about why that software is recommended for your HUD setup. So that all ties in with this idea of a next generation HUD. We're going to define that term very shortly. We'll have a look at the main HUD panel. So that's what appears at the tables as you play. We'll then talk about the pop-up configuration. Then we'll talk about the different facets of a HUD. Now, historically, the purpose of a HUD is simply to display information on our opponents in real time. But in the modern era, the usage of a HUD has expanded to include other important areas. So yes, the HUD is still valued for villain analysis at the table, but it's also valued for villain analysis off the table. As we'll go on to discuss, using different trackers, if you want to run off-table analysis, you'll often need to access a completely separate set of stats in order to run the analysis, which in some ways is counterproductive. You have to have two setups to analyze the same opponent. In other words, when we're at the table, we use the HUD and the pop-ups, but when we're running analysis on the same villain off-table, we use a completely different setup. We use one of the reports in our tracker. Now, okay, there are workarounds for this, but I would imagine that the average player uses the functionality of their tracker as intended. In other words, they do have these two separate setups for analyzing villain on-table and analyzing villain off-table. We'll talk about how we can just completely avoid that when using the hand-to-note tracker. A lot of the focus of the last videos of this Expert Exploit series, so this video and the following two videos, are to do with specific villain exploitation. So just as a recap for the series so far, we've looked at general exploitation principles, and we've then moved on to population exploits. We've run population analysis using my Death Star HUD to figure out what the leaks of the average player are. But of course, all the time we're running this analysis, we're keeping in mind that not every opponent conforms to the average. And it's possible that we have a decent sample size of hands on a specific opponent. We can see that they are deviating from average tendencies. We obviously need to adjust our game plan specifically against them. In fact, this is the most important thing, that we tailor our counter strategy based on our opponent. The reason why it doesn't always happen that way in practice is because it can take a while to get a significant sample size on our opponents. Until we have that decent sample size, or we have some type of read, we have to stick to our understanding of the population tendencies. So although villain-specific exploitation is one of the most important factors in exploitative play, it's not always the most relevant factor in exploitative play, because perhaps we don't have that sample size on villain. We're going to be assuming in this video and the following two videos that we do have a reasonable sample size, and we can therefore use that sample to construct a game plan against an individual opponent. So in this video, we'll just be initiating that process. We'll have a basic look at how we can run villain analysis using the hand-to-note tracking software, along with my Death Star HUD. But we're also going to have a look at the other factors of HUD usage. We'll have a look at self-analysis, i.e. how we can do a database review on ourselves using the HUD configuration rather than a selection of filters and reports. You can still do that in hand-to-note, by the way. You can still run reports with various filters. But seeing as we've invested so much time in building this really excellent stats package, we might as well use that to run the analysis rather than being counterproductive and having a completely separate set of tools for doing self-analysis. We'll then look how we can run population analysis. We'll see how we run it, but we've already seen it actually being run in many of the earlier videos in this series. So before we do that, let's just have a discussion on what we mean by next generation HUDs. Again, like many of the things that you might see in some of my videos, this is a completely made up expression. So if you're talking to another poker player and they don't know what next generation HUDs are, well, it might just be that is because they've never seen any of my content. The definition should be pretty straightforward. Next generation carries a connotation of something being quite advanced. Just a quick history on HUD usage. There was a time about 10 years ago when no one really had a HUD. Everyone was just playing. And then the first HUDs they didn't even come included with the tracking software. You actually had to have an additional script that ran alongside the tracking software to have a HUD running at the table. So at that point, most players didn't have a HUD. It was a lot of extra hassle to get the HUD working. So some players were beginning to track their stats, but that didn't automatically mean that they had a HUD up and running. During that time, when you look at the average HUD setup, many players had 3 or 4 stats on their HUD. Very common setup was VPIP, PFR, and 3-bet. Maybe VPIP, PFR, and aggression factor. Maybe all 4 of those stats, with especially advanced HUD users at the time. You get the idea, there weren't really many stats on the HUD. The way it progressed was players were adding more and more stats to the HUD, so you ended up with these guys who not only had 20 plus stats on their main HUD panel, but they also had a decent amount of configured stats in the pop-ups. Now that might sound like a modern HUD, but we're really still talking about over 5 years ago. Players had lots of stats on their main panel, and they had lots of stats in the pop-ups. So how have HUDs advanced since then? Well, the first adjustment is additional features. For example, heat maps, post-flop diagrams, and badges. So a heat map shows you a whole cards grid of the types of hands someone shows up with when they take a certain line. For example, our opponent 3-bets pre-flop. There's usually a heat map we can access that shows us historically all of the hands that they've 3-bet pre-flop in that spot. And of course you can configure that heat map however you want. It could be overall 3-bet, it could be 3-bet specifically from the big blind, whatever we like. Post-flop diagrams, same kind of idea but for post-flop play. So obviously in the context of post-flop play we can't just show a whole cards grid. Well, I suppose we could, but it wouldn't be that relevant because the strength of a hand now depends also on the flop texture, the turn card, etc. So the way a post-flop diagram will work is it will show the different types of hands that a player shows up with post-flop. Badges, these are small graphics that appear on the main HUD panel to indicate something specific about villain. I don't make use of badges in my Death Star HUD, but I did used to use badges in my Holder Manager 2 HUD. For example, I had a badge if someone was folding too often to continuation bets after they call a 3-bet. So without needing to access any pop-ups, if this specific badge appeared on my opponent, I would know that it might be a good target for me to 3-bet somewhat more aggressively against them because they are folding to a large amount of continuation bets post-flop. Now I'll just give you some quick examples of how this works. So we have here a villain taken from random in the database that I have right here. And what we can see over on the right hand side is an example of a heat map. So these are the hands that this player has open raised on the button. Or more specifically, they're the hands that he's open raised on the button and then reached showdown with. Because obviously the tracker has no way of knowing what someone open raised if they didn't reach showdown. The exception, of course, is if we're talking about hero, because obviously if it's us, then the tracker knows which hands we have regardless of whether we reach showdown or not. One thing we'll notice about the heat map information is it's going to be more accurate for hero and less accurate for villains. Villains' heat maps are very often going to be slightly weighted towards strength. That's something to keep in mind. Because on average, the stronger hands are going to be more likely to reach showdown than the weaker hands. We can see if we use this tab system here, that we can see a heat map from every position. So this is his small blind RFI range historically. And notice there's some gaps there. This is to do with sample size. We have about 85k hands on this villain. So obviously if he open raises ace-8 suited and ace-10 suited, he probably open raises ace-9 suited as well. He just didn't pick up that hand over the sample, or more specifically, he didn't reach showdown with that hand after open raising from the small blind. Cutoff, let's see, similar idea from every position. So that's an example of a heat map. Now let's see a post-flop diagram. This is the flop c-bet OOP pop-up. Let's imagine we want to get a feel for which type of hands this player is firing a continuation bet with out of position. We can bring up the pop-up on this stat, and yes, pop-ups can have pop-ups, we'll discuss that shortly. What we can see here is an example of a post-flop diagram. So you see the different types of hand that this player has fired a continuation bet, OOP, in a single raised heads-up pot. Now you can configure the categories here. We can also access the hands directly. For example, let's imagine we have this category here, top pair weak kicker, and we want to see which types of top pair weak kicker villain has fired a continuation bet with out of position. Perhaps we typically like to check call those hands instead, so we're curious to see why villains c-betting those hands. If we hover over the bar as part of the post-flop diagram, we can now see the selection of hands that this player has fired a continuation bet with out of position in a single raised heads up pot. Hopefully you can already begin to see the power of this relative to a configuration that simply has a large amount of stats. See, there's a lot of additional features here, and the ability to access the hand histories is a feature in itself. So if I want to see an example, I can click this replay button. It's going to bring up the replay and it's going to show me the hand, and I can click through the hand. There's also this algebraic notation of the hand here, so if I understand this, by the way, the colors mean something, the numbers mean something, I actually don't need to open this hand. Once you understand the algebraic notation, you can see everything that happens here without needing to fire up the hand in the replayer. So when I write direct hand history access as one of the features of next generation HUD, hopefully you can see what I mean by that now. Let's say in the past we have this configuration with lots of stats in the pop-ups, and we have one stat, continuation bet, OOP. In the past, if you have just a basic stat in Holder Manager or Poker Tracker, just because you have the stat doesn't mean that you can access the hands that constitute towards generating that stat. In fact, what you'd have to do is acknowledge what the stat is, then you'd have to jump over to the other side, i.e. the report side of the tracker, then you'd have to construct a filter which shows you the spots where villain fires a continuation bet out of position. We've managed to cut all of that extra work out because, as you've seen, all we needed to do was hover our pointer over the stat and we get access to the information, we get access to the hand histories. So hopefully just on that alone you can see there's a huge difference between the types of HUDs that the best players are using in the modern era compared to the HUDs that they were using 5 years ago. Here we have 3 additional features of hand to note. We have custom definitions, automatic definitions, and mass cloning. Now 2 of those features at the time of making this video are exclusive to hand to note. So the exclusive features are automatic definitions and mass cloning. Let's talk about custom definitions first of all. So in the past, when players were setting up these HUD configurations, perhaps even one of the ones with a large number of stats in the pop-ups, they would be using exclusively definitions given to them by the tracker. PT4 did actually have some custom configuration option, but it was somewhat difficult to use. You had to literally write the code for the stats, but you did technically have the option to create custom definition, and some players with the know-how did do that, but in general, players were using definitions provided by the tracker. Now at some point there came some additional software known as NoteCaddy, which initially you could integrate just with Holder Manager, but in more recent times you can now integrate NoteCaddy with Poker Tracker. And one of the features of NoteCaddy is it allows users to generate custom definitions. So that's the reason why this custom definition feature is not exclusive to Hand to Note, because although in the case of Hand to Note it's built into the software, you don't need any extra scripts, it is possible to generate custom stats using Holder Manager and Poker Tracker along with NoteCaddy. So we can see the next evolution in the chain. We've got these players with large amounts of stats, but all of those stats are provided by the tracker. We now begin to see players with even more stats because they've unlocked the custom definitions using something like NoteCaddy or using Hand to Note. So they can now have as many stats as they want, and they can have very specific stats which were not originally provided by the tracker. So really the evolution here is going in 2 directions. Yes, there's going to be more and more stats, but as time goes on, players using more and more specific stats. So for example, in the past you would have a stat, for example, fold to c-bet. Then the next version of that would be fold to c-bet in a single raised heads up pot. Then in modern HUDs we have things like fold to c-bet in a single raised heads up pot facing a 1/3 sizing, facing a half pot sizing, etc. We can see the level of specificalness increases as time goes on, and you won't find stats like that as default definitions within your tracker. You won't find fold to a c-bet OOP in a single raised heads up pot when facing a 1/3 sizing. If the tracker was going to go to that degree of specificalness, we'd literally end up having trackers shipping with 100,000 plus stats, and they don't really want to do that. But it's okay because we now have the ability to create our own stat definitions. So players using NoteCaddy, they would, if they had a lot of time and patience, they might come out with some type of HUD package, maybe with 300 plus stats. If they were especially dedicated, they might even have a package with 500 stats. But it took a very long time. Every single definition had to be coded individually. And this is where hand to note comes in. There's two key features. The first is automatic definition. So the way this works is, for every definition you create in hand to note automatically creates another 50 definitions or so. Let me just show you how that works. So here is the probe turn pop-up on the Death Star HUD. You can see this player is probing the turn 34% of the time. You'll probably know from earlier in the series that this is probably not a very good exploitative value. In terms of game theory, this value can be somewhat low, but this player is not playing exploitatively. We can see that straight away. Now if we bring up the pop-up, everything you see in this pop-up is auto-generated by hand to note. Yes, we can configure various aspects of the output, but these are all stats that are created on the basis of that one definition. In other words, we create this stat, probe turn, and then hand to note generates all of the information you see in this pop-up based on that one definition. To do the equivalent using NoteCaddy would take a very long time. You literally have to sit there for at least a day, probably a few days, just to generate the pop-up on this one stat. And when we see the amount of stats just in this one pop-up, and that's not even including the tab system, by the way, so you can see the different tabs we can click as well. To generate the pop-ups for all of these stats, you're now talking about a very long time. You're talking about months of work just to complete this one overall pop-up. And of course, there's many pop-ups at the top, all with their own tab system, etc. It's just going to be virtually impossible. So this removes a lot of the legwork for us because it automatically processes these definitions. So just as a quick idea, first of all, we have next actions. So after this player probes a turn, how often is their next action fold, call, raise, bet, or check? We can also see how often they take this line versus hero. We can also see how often they win the hand when they take this line, how often they go to showdown when they take this line, how often they win at showdown when they take this line. We can also see information regarding the bet sizing. We can see specific range distribution information based on the bet sizing. For example, if this player likes to probe close to pot size, what does the distribution of holdings within his range look like? Well, there we go. And we can access the specific hole card information as well. If we hover over the bar, we can access specific hand histories. So remember, all of this would have to be run in a report using a filter. For example, if we wanted to know the types of hands that a player would bet 2/3 pot with when they probe bet the turn, we'd have to construct a filter for that to get this kind of output. Then once we had that filter, we'd have to modify the filter by each of these hand categories. In other words, just by hovering the cursor over the relevant bar, we're essentially running several filters at the same time. So we see the power of this. We can just instantaneously run large amounts of filters without ever leaving the pop-up system. And so much of this is auto-generated. We can also see next villain actions. So what's the difference between next actions and next villain actions? Well, the first next action refers to the owner of the pop-up. So let's call him some hero. So this is what some hero does after he probe bets a turn. Next villain action, this is what some hero's opponent does after some hero probes a turn. So this is how often his opponent historically has been falling to probe bets, how often he's been calling, how often he's been raising. Obviously he can't bet or check when facing a probe bet, so there's no data for that. We can see profit information. We can see an overall post-flop diagram. I guessed at 50 stats, but really when you think about it, there's probably a lot more than 50 stats here. Let's assume 50 stats, so we're just going to have a bit of fun with the calculator. Let's assume we now have our intensive 500 stat version of our pop-ups. But now for every stat we create, hand to note auto-generates an additional 50 stats. We're now talking about a configuration with 25,000 definitions or so. Now that might seem insane, but wait until what's coming next, which is the mass cloning feature. So what this essentially allows us to do is to copy and paste a large amount of stats, but process them via a certain filter. let me show you how this works. Or more specifically, rather than show you how mass cloning works, I'm going to show you the product of that mass clone. Let's imagine we have this fault to CBET imposition pop up. We've spent a long time doing it, and it certainly would take a long time with NoteCaddy. Let's say we say to ourselves we want the same information, but we want it specifically for ace high dry textures. Then we want the same info specifically for king high dry textures. What you'd have to do with NoteCaddy, completely possible by the way, but you'd have to manually code every single one of these stats. Yes, you could work off an existing stat, so you could take, for example, fault to CBET imposition, then you could duplicate that, and then you could input the data to make sure it's an ace high dry texture. So you don't have to code the definition from scratch, but you still have to physically touch every single definition in order for it to be valid. So you have to take this stat, change the board texture to ace high, take the next stat, change the board texture to ace high. Unfortunately, because NoteCaddy is not as smooth as it should be, you might want to factor in a minute or so for each of the definitions. Suddenly, just to create one board texture, you're looking at maybe 60 minutes or so. Then to run through the other board textures, you can see suddenly this is a day's work to create this tab system. And then, of course, you have to go to fault to CBET OOP. You want to break that down by board texture. That's another day's work. You can see your time's just slipping away. You can achieve the same thing. You can construct both of these pop-ups along with the tabs in less than half an hour. So if we assume we already have the main version of the pop-up here, in the pop-up editor, we can just copy all of these stats, draw a box around them, i.e. select them, right-click, choose Mass Clone, decide which filter we want to process all of the stats by at once. So we go to Mass Clone, we input our ace high board texture. Hand to note takes maybe 5 seconds or so, then it spits out all of these stats again, but processed by the board texture. As you can see, we don't have data for every spot. That's to do with sample size. But now if we have a look at the definition for this stat, you can see here the board texture is there. You can see it's a fault to a CBET OOP. By the way, this is something that you have to be very careful with if you're using default definitions given to you by the tracker. There's not a decent way of knowing exactly how the definition is constructed. So you might think you're getting fault to CBET in a single raised heads up pot, and what you're actually getting is fault to CBET in any spot. Could be in position, OOP, could be in a 3-bet pot, could be in a multi-way pot. We don't know unless we can access the definition. With the stats in hand to note, you can see the exact definition. Even if it's a default stat that ships with hand to note, you can see exactly how the stat is defined. So we just mass clone everything again, choose the king high dry texture, get the idea, we get stats for the king high dry, for as many different board textures as we want, and for each pop-up we're creating, it's going to take maybe a minute for the entire pop-up, and that's if we're quite slow with the mass clone feature. So what this means is, because we have this ability to make so many stats by default, that last time I checked, this is shipping, i.e. the Death Star HUD is shipping with 8,000 definitions or so, not including the automatic definitions. Just has 8,000 definitions out of the box, and that was last time I counted, which was quite a while back, so it could have even more than that at this stage. So rather than 500 stats multiplied by 50, let's assume we have roughly 8,000 stats by default as part of the Death Star HUD. Multiply that by 50, because remember, for each of these 8,000 stats, hand to note is generating, or auto-generating, at least an additional 50 stats. 8,000 times by 50. The Death Star HUD is essentially shipping with 400,000 stat definitions. So those guys who have these big baller HUDs with 500 definitions starts to look like child's play compared to the power of a next generation HUD. And you can really only unlock this with hand to note at this stage. Although you could technically do this with NoteCaddy, you'd have to manually construct 400,000 stat definitions, and it's just not going to be viable. It would take a very, very long amount of time. You'd have to have a dedicated team of people working on this around the clock, whereas this is something that I've created by myself. I'm not going to say it didn't take a long time. It has taken a long time, but it's viable for me as an individual to produce a stats package with almost 500,000 stats. In fact, it will have 500,000 stats by the time I'm completely finished with it. Now, of course, having that sheer amount of stats can actually lead to some problems, which we'll discuss a bit later in the video, but there is an elegant solution which I'll refer to as profiling. Final aspect of next generation HUDs, which we've already touched on, is that now this is a multi-purpose tools package. Maybe HUD, or the term HUD, is doing this an injustice because it's really a package that has several features. So it's not just for analyzing our opponent anymore, it's also for analyzing our own game, i.e. database analysis, and also for population analysis, as we've seen throughout the series. So literally any one of those 400,000 plus data points you can generate population information for. As you can see, we live in a very interesting time where we have more data than ever about the tendencies of the player pool. If you know how to use that information correctly, you will generate a big edge against your opponents. So let's just talk about the main HUD panel on the Death Star. So the idea with the main HUD panel is we should have the highest frequency stats on the main panel. So there will be a decent amount of information on the main panel, but the objective is not to make the main panel look like it's the control panel in a spaceship. I have seen guys with perhaps even 100 stats on the main panel, and sometimes their reasoning is, well, I don't like pop-ups very much. If I try and bring up the pop-ups, everything lags, so I have to put everything on the main panel. Probably not a very good idea to do that. If your HUD's lagging, you need to figure out why that's the case. Perhaps you need to upgrade your hardware, perhaps you need to reconfigure your HUD. We'll talk about how we've had to do something similar with a technique I'll call profiling. But also, the reason why you don't want your HUD to be that big is that your HUD shouldn't be blocking table information. There's a number of times that I've railed players and the HUD panel is blocking important information such as the button, villain's whole card information, who's posted the blinds, bet sizings of players, pot size. This is important information. You want to be able to see it without needing to constantly be arranging HUD panels. So if you've had the experience of every single time all the chips go in, you have to move a HUD panel to see villains' whole cards, that means that you haven't arranged your HUD panel very well, or your HUD panel is simply too big. So we can see here an example of my HUD panel. So I have actually embedded the HUD panel into a pop-up. That's something you can do with Hand to Note. So I use this very often for villain analysis and also for database analysis. So if a student comes to me for database analysis, I usually fire up this pop-up system and I go to the Open Raise tab because I know there I can see the overall panel. So this is my window into someone's overall game. I start by looking at these stats for an indication whether there's going to be problems in other areas. And if there is a problem in another area, then I'll go to the more specific information. For example, if I see this player is only float betting the flop 32% of the time, which is the case, I'll know that there's very likely a problem with that. So I'll bring up the float bet pop-up and I can run some further analysis. We'll be discussing in more depth how we can analyze specific leaks using this HUD panel in the later parts of this series. For now, I'm just going to run through the stats on the main panel because they are for the most part the stats that you need. And the idea is any stat which will consult with a high frequency should be on the main panel. So an example of this is fold big blind to small blind still. So you can see the value there is 40%, so it's the one in the top left. So just as an example, this is a stat which we absolutely don't want to put in our pop-up. Some players do that and they say, well, when I get into the small blind and I'm first to act, I'll bring up the pop-up. But basically what that means is we have to access a pop-up every single time it's folded around to us in the small blind. That's going to be a lot of extra clicking. That's an example of a stat that realistically wants to be on the main panel. It's something that we need to access very often. So our goal really is to minimize our pop-up usage. We still have to use the pop-ups and we will be making detailed use of them even in-game. But our goal is still to minimize the amount of clicking that we need to do, especially valid if we're playing very long sessions. You've got to think about every click as energy used up. And if you're doing excess clicking, you're going to get worn out a lot faster. Another example would be something such as fold to donk. And many players say, well, if it's relevant, I'll check the pop-up. But think about how frequently that's going to be relevant. Every single time with a cold call at OOP, we have to make the decision regarding whether to check to the PFR or not. It means we're going to be having to bring up a pop-up. Why? To check if our opponent is folding too often to donk bets. Most players just don't do that, or they don't want to do that. They don't even check that info, in fact, which of course we should. We should always be aware of what someone's fold to donk bet is on the flop. Do we want to bring up a pop-up every single time with a PFR or OOP after cold calling? Absolutely not. That's a high frequency spot. It's obvious that we want to put that information on our HUD panel and not in the pop-ups. Now if we take something like fold to flop 3-bet or fold to turn 3-bet, if you're putting that on your main panel, then you're wasting space with a stat that doesn't really need to be used with a high frequency. So just keep that in mind. That is the function of the panel. And although it's possible you might end up with some slightly different stats, the principle is going to be the same. Anything you use frequently must be on the panel. You can obviously duplicate the information in the pop-up somewhere, but it must be on the panel. And anything that you don't use frequently does not want to be on the main panel, because you're now increasing the size of your HUD panel, increasing the chance you block off important table information. So let's just run through the stats on the main panel. So at the top left we have fold big blind to small blind still. And this value 67 is fold versus button open. In other words, fold blinds to steal, or fold blinds to button still, but it's an average. So in other words, the first stat helps us figure out how wide we should open in the small blind. Second stat helps us figure out how wide we should open from the button. So these are two very high frequency spots. Next stat is ATS. That's an average of how wide our opponent open raises from cutoff, button, and small blind. It's an average, so it gives us an idea of how aggressive villain is in late position. Next stat is fold to 4-bet. Then we have 4-bet range, which is 4.6 for this player. Fold to 3-bet, and then the overall 3-bet frequency. Sometimes whether a stat should be on the main panel or not can be determined by the sample size required to have decent info on that stat. For example, we put the overall 3-bet stat in the main panel, but we don't have fold button to 3-bet, fold cutoff to 3-bet, fold small blind to 3-bet, because you'd need a big sample size on your opponent to have that kind of data. So it doesn't make sense to put it on the panel. It's just wasted space for the vast majority of opponents. That's the kind of thing we put in the pop-up. You can see positional information here in the pop-up. More on pop-up shortly. Second line of the HUD, we have VPIP, PFR. These are color-coded, so they can change based on the aggression levels of villain. So if he's very tight, they'll appear as orange. If he's loose, they'll be green. If he's quite aggro, they'll be cyan, etc. Cold cool in blue, 22%. So there's something not right with that, by the way. It should be about 13% for most players. We'll talk more about specific numbers in the next part of the series. Bright green, raise versus flop c-bet and single raise heads up pots. I made the decision to put single raise heads up pots mostly on the main panel for post flop. If I want multi-way information or I want 3-bet pot information, I'll bring up the pop-up for that. But single raised heads up pots are very likely the highest frequency scenario. That's why we put that data on the panel. And sometimes if you're using your default definitions with Holder Manager or Poker Tracker, you have to be very careful to verify which of these stats are actually heads up single raised pots, which of them include multi-way pots, which of them include 3-bet pots, etc. It's not always obvious from the stat definition. Next stat in dark green, we have fold flop c-bet to raise. By the way, I employ a very simple color-coded system here, which is, for the most part, aggression stats are in a bright, vivid color. For example, raising flop c-bets is in bright green, but folding stats, i.e. fold c-bet to raise, is in dark green. The next stat we have is fold turn c-bet to raise and single raise heads up pot, so that's 21. So there's definitely a problem with that stat as well. Then we have limp, open limp specifically, because we're using this to try and identify recreational players, and of course regs might decide to limp behind or complete in the small blind. This is exclusively open limp from a position other than the small blind. You see the data in the pop-ups there. So next line we have continuation bet on the flop, turn, and river in single raised heads up pots. We then have fold to c-bet in position in single raised heads up pots on the flop, turn, and river. So one line is going to be in position and the other line is going to be out of position. One of the cool features of next generation HUDs is it's possible to make dynamic features of the HUD. So although you can see two lines on the panel here, so the top line of those cyan stats is in position, so c-bet in position, fold to c-bet in position by street. And the lower of the two lines is OOP, so we've got flop c-bet OOP on flop, turn, and river single raise heads up pots, and fold to c-bet OOP, single raise heads up pots on flop, turn, and river. Only one of these two lines will appear on the HUD depending on the context. So if we're in position and our opponent is out of position, we're going to see the out of position data on villain. So when we see this fold to c-bet stat, we know it's automatically going to be displayed as out of position. That's something you can do with next generation HUDs as well, as you can have dynamic info that changes based on the setup. So I don't use that feature too much, because sometimes the feature might break on specific rooms or it might get disabled. For example, PokerStars has certain regulations now regarding what's acceptable and what's not. But I found this simple dynamic adjustment works on every room I've tried so far. So if villain's OOP, it shows one line of data on him. If he's in position, it shows the other line of data. The line at the end is specifically for 3-bet pots. So we have fold to c-bet in position in 3-bet pots and fold to c-bet OOP in 3-bet pots. So it can sometimes factor into our decision regarding whether to 3-bet pre-flop, is how often our opponent folds to continuation bets, or the type of range we use when 3-betting pre-flop might depend on villain's post-flop tendencies. Moving on, we have these dark yellow numbers, so you should know instantly, even if you've never seen my HUD before, that these are actually folding stats, because like we said, dark colors are folding stats. So here, we have fold to turn probe. We then have fold to follow-up bet after calling turn probe. So let's say villain checks back the flop instead of firing continuation bet. The first stat is how often he folds to the turn bet or the turn probe bet, 46. Then the next stat is how often he folds to the follow-up bet on the river after calling the turn probe. So this is basically 2-barrel information. That next stat is fold to delayed c-bet, also including follow-up information in the pop-ups, etc. We'll get to the pop-ups shortly. And then in the middle of the dark yellow and bright yellow stats, we have the donk bet flop, and then fold to donk bet. And of course, in the pop-ups, we break it down by different streets, etc. So this guy doesn't really donk bet too much. Bright yellow is basically the opposite of the dark yellow stats, so they're the aggression stats. This is how often villain probes the turn, 34%. How often he follows up on the river after probing the turn, 56%. By the way, another cool feature of next generation HUDs is that you can create definitions that are based around villain's hole card information. What that allows us to do is calculate a bluffing frequency when villain takes a certain line. So how often is villain bluffing when he follows up on the river? 11%. This is the kind of thing that you just cannot do using default definitions provided by the tracker. You can't have these whole card based stats. You can do this with NoteCaddy, by the way. It's very, very valuable information because it tells us whether we should be bluff catching the river or not. Against his opponent, because he only bluffs the river 11% of the time after he pro bets the turn, so we're not going to be bluff catching at all. If you have any bluff catcher, it's going to be a very straightforward fold on the river. Finally, we have delayed c-bet, 29%, so this guy does not delayed c-bet either. Next line, we have float bet information, so the bottom line of the panel. So we have fold to flop float bet, fold to turn float bet, fold to river float bet, and of course we have information in the pop-ups as well. More on those shortly. Then we have the fold to flop donk bet stat in the middle there. Then the bright yellow numbers, we have float bet flop, float bet turn, float bet river. So those are the stats that I recommend for the main panel. I would say beware of using overly generic stats. So in my opinion, gone are the days when players have stats such as aggression factor, aggression frequency, went to showdown, won at showdown, one win saw flop. If you have any of these stats on your main panel, it's debatable whether you really should. Because in most cases, there's always a better stat to use. So sometimes I play a game with my students because I do come across some players who are very, very attached to stats such as aggression factor, aggression frequency, one win saw flop, went to showdown, won at showdown. So the game is as follows. I say to the student, you show me which spot you would use that stat. Let's say AF, for example. You show me a scenario where you would use AF to make your decision, and I'll tell you which stat you should be using in that spot. So let's just contrive a scenario where that might happen. Let's say AF, just for argument's sake, let's say the student loves to use the aggression factor for whatever reason. Let's say it's a situation where we're facing a river continuation bet. So the student will say something like, well, I would use AF in this spot. We can see that villain has an AF of 4, which is very, very high. Therefore, I'm going to be bluff catching a lot on the river. So I'd say, okay, that might be true, but what's a more relevant stat we can check in this spot? C-bet river is bluff. so much more accurate, so much more tailored to the situation. Remember, AF is just an aggregate of everything that happens over villain's entire game plan. At the very least, if you were determined to use AF, you might use AF specific for a river c-bet situation, for example. But no need to do any of that because there's a much more accurate stat, which is c-bet river is bluff. And if it's a single raise heads up pot, c-bet river is bluff in a single raise heads up pot. And if it's above a frequency where we bluff catch, we bluff catch. If it's below a frequency where we can bluff catch, then obviously we just make the hero fold with our bluff catches. But then sometimes heroes say something like, yeah, but to get a sample size on the river c-bet stat, I don't have the sample, so I'll just use AF in this spot instead. Just because we have more of a sample size on a certain stat does not make it any more accurate or fitting for the situation. So it's a little bit like facing a turn continuation bet, for example, and saying, well, I don't have information for villain's turn barrel stat, so I'll just use his 3-bet preflop stat instead. I have more of a sample size on that. Just because you have more of a sample size does not mean it's a good stat for making the decision in that situation. I don't have villain's river raise versus 2-bet stat, so I'm just going to use his flop c-bet stat instead. I have a much better sample size on that stat. You might think to yourself, well, we have to use some information, right? We don't want to be making these decisions blindly. That's exactly what a big part of this series has all been about. If you don't have information on a certain spot, what do we use? The population tendencies. If we've done our analysis, we have very good information on the average tendencies of an unknown opponent, so why just use some random stat that doesn't apply to the situation purely because we have some kind of sample size on it? So basically, you don't want those stats on your main panel because they take up space and ultimately they're not that useful, they're far too generic. Remember, one of the ways that next generation HUD users gain an advantage over players using an outdated HUD configuration is the specificalness of the stats that they use. We want to be as specific as possible. We want stats that target the precise situation, and if we don't have a stat which is appropriate to a certain degree of accuracy, that's when we resort to population tendencies. We don't just pick some other random stat and say, well, I'll use that stat instead because I have more of a sample. So let's talk about the pop-ups. Now, you've already seen some of them. So the first point is regarding the construction of this HUD. Each stat on the main panel should have its own pop-up with related data. Let's just see how that works. So for example, if I have a look at the flop c-bet stat, I can see it's 49 in position for single raise heads up pots. If I click on that, I get a pop-up. It's got all of the information regarding c-betting. Breaks it down by board texture. It looks at related lines such as delayed c-bet, etc. It assumes that villain might sometimes skip his c-bet. We can see how he plays against turn pro bets, etc. Just to give you another example, if we were to pick raise versus flop c-bet, for example, we have raise versus c-bet information. We have barreling information after raising the flop c-bet. We have fold to flop 3-bet. Anything that's related to that stat itself. Let's try pre-flop 1. 3-bet pre-flop is 8.2. So we have 3-bet broken down by position. Have it broken down by 3-bet sizing. We have it broken down by the opening position of the opponent. We have it broken down by position versus position. You have a look at this positional here. So on the left-hand side, we have the 3-better's position. So big blind, how often does he 3-bet against small blind? 7.5. Against button, 6.9. Against cutoff, 5.1. If he's in the small blind, 3-bet 13% against the button, 11 against the cutoff. You get the idea. And of course, this being a next generation HUD, all of this is backed up by heat maps. Did I make these heat maps? No. Hand to note generated them based on the stat. Any preflop stat I have is now backed up by a heat map. As we've already alluded to, this kind of thing would just take forever in notecading. You might have heat maps for a few key spots, but to just have a heat map for every spot versus every spot like this, basically impossible with any other software. What I'm going to do now is just click through the various pop-ups. I'm not really going to say too much, just going to give you an option just to see what's available. I'm not going to click through all of the tabs, but you can see there are a lot of tabs. Specific positional info. So I'm just going to give you a rough idea of each pop-up. See, for example, 4-bet pots has an aggressor and a caller tab. Same for 3-bet pots as well. which we'll get to shortly. Fold to pre-flop 3-bet here. We have like 4-bet versus 5-bet versus squeeze, etc. 3-bet pre-flop. Some squeeze information there as well. VPIP and PFR, so I just have the open raise pop up over these, the ones with the whole cards grids on for the raise first in ranges. Cold call, we've already seen that one. Raise first flop c-bet, again with tab system here for the various board textures, also for 3-bet and 4-bet pots. Fold flop c-bet to raise, again with the board textures there. Fold turn c-bet to raise, same pop-up for some of them, which is completely fine. So for example, all of the c-bet stats have the same pop-up, all of the fold to c-bet stats have the same pop-up, etc. 3-bet pots pop-up, again broken down by board texture and broken down by villain is aggressor and villain is cooler. We have versus probe bets broken down by different positions, versus follow-up bets, so the same pop-up for those, versus delayed c-bets. Donk bet, and again that's broken down by board texture. We also have probe turn and the follow-up bet, and that's broken down by some of the positions over on the right hand side. This is the fold to delayed c-bet. You can also access them through these tabs as well, so this is the delayed c-bet pop-up in 3-bet pots and 4-bet pots. It's just easier to see how they're attached to the main panel this way. So fold versus float bets. See, that's broken down by board texture and by position. Fold to donk. Some of the definitions need reprocessing, I would imagine, or it could just be that there's no sample. Float bet flop. So you've seen a basic idea. There may be some pop-ups we haven't seen. For example, there's a new pop-up, fold to turn. What this pop-up does is it shows turn tendencies given a certain flop sizing. So let's say, for example, we want to know how our opponent plays on the turn after calling a 1/3 c-bet, for example. Then we see that kind of information. So that's a brand new pop-up. And there's more pop-ups coming all of the time. It's a work in progress. There's already, as we've mentioned, probably close to 400,000 total definitions, including the auto-generated definitions. But by the time I'm done with this, there'll be 500,000 plus total definitions, I would imagine. Now, on that topic, if you imagine that we're at the tables, there's 16 tables running, and for every villain on each of these tables, Hand to Note's trying to process 400,000 plus definitions. What's going to be the side effect? There's potentially going to be some lag. You might not be able to run this. So what we have to do is split our pop-ups into different profiles. So that's exactly what I've done. I'll show you how it works. This is one of the options menus in Hand to Note. So we have the full pop-up profile, which I refer to as the Death Star HUD. But then I have other profiles as well. For example, I have the Star Destroyer, which has a lot less stats in the pop-ups. And then I have the Tiderian Shuttle, which is a light version of the pop-ups. So for the Tiderian Shuttle, there's no tabs. There's only one pop-up for each stat. So there's no tab system whatsoever. What that allows us to do is to run a HUD lag-free for play at the tables while still having access to all of the stats which are going to converge quite quickly over a smaller sample size. So the idea is we use one profile for gaming at the tables, then we use the other profile for analysis. We use the big profile for population analysis, villain analysis off table, and then for in-game we use the Tiderian Shuttle or whichever profile we can run. If you have a really beastie machine, then you can think about running the Death Star HUD at the tables if you want to. But the idea is most of us are probably going to end up running the light profile for play at the tables. It's a very similar layout, it just doesn't have as many of the tabs. So I think it's definitely an advantage to have a custom HUD like the Death Star HUD, and that's because the stats have been configured by the user. You can also see the definitions of those stats. As I was saying earlier, sometimes with Holo Manager, although you can see the name of the definition, you don't really know what you're going to get. As we've also seen, pop-ups can have pop-ups. And I think that's something that you might not be able to do with Holo Manager or Poker Tracker just yet. You can see the feature integrates very seamlessly into Hand to Note, where a pop-up can just have any number of pop-ups. And right now, we're using the auto-generated pop-ups. You can also just add another pop-up into your pop-ups. So you can have a custom pop-up rather than the auto-generated pop-up within a pop-up. Also, we can have tabs. Again, that's something I'm not really sure if that works on Holo Manager or Poker Tracker just yet. but the way it expands the amount of definitions that we can display. As an example, let's just have a look at the float flop pop-up. Down the left hand side we have the board textures. But after specifying the board texture, it's possible to break it down even further by position, because it's essentially a layered tab system where each of these tabs has tabs inside it. Allows you to be very, very specific. For example, if I go to Queen to 10 high jewelry, and then let's say I select button. Well, there's no sample on button, so let me try big blind. This stat here in the top left will be very specifically float flop in the big blind for single raised heads up pot on a Queen to 10 high jewelry texture. So if I hover my cursor over there, if there's any sample, we'll be able to see the hand. In this case, if the hand doesn't reach showdown, we won't be able to see the information on it. But what I'd ordinarily be able to do, especially if this was Heroes database, for example, I'd be able to see all of the hands that float bet the flop from the big blind in a single raised heads up pot when the board texture was Queen to 10 high jewelry. So that means the high cards either Queen, Jack, or 10, and it's a connected texture. So it could be something like Queen 10, 7, 2-tone, for example. Okay, let's move on to villain-specific analysis. Hopefully we already have most of the information we need for this now. So on-table versus off-table analysis. So on-table analysis is we're actually playing at the tables. We're going to use some light HUD profile for that. But then off-table, we'll just use the full range of stats, assuming we have the sample size. And that's quite important as well. If you do just have 1,000 hands on villain, we're clearly not going to be spending a large amount of time analyzing float bet big blind in a single raised heads up pot when the board texture is Queen to 10 high jewelry. Doesn't make any sense. That's the kind of thing you might analyze if you had a very large sample on villain, or if we're running population analysis. In fact, even a stat that specific, I would say it's unlikely we're going to be using it for an individual villain, and more likely we're going to be using it for population analysis with a database of something like 10 million hands, in my opinion. So when we run villain analysis, we only want to be as specific as the sample size dictates. So if you have a few thousand hands, we're obviously going to be looking at somewhat specific stats. But if you have, let's say, 3,000 hands on villain, you might not even be breaking down c-bet tendencies by board texture. You'd probably need 100,000 hands for that, for example. So don't waste your time analyzing stats which are not relevant given the sample size. It takes a little bit of experience to understand which stats become relevant at which sample sizes. But for the most part, if you have a few thousand hands, you'll obviously be analyzing c-bet tendencies, but you probably won't be breaking it down by board texture or position. With 100,000, you might be breaking it down by board texture and position, but not both at the same time, because to break it down by both at the same time, now that's kind of the territory of having several million hands on villain. Otherwise, it's just not worth it. And even 100,000 hands, some of that textural specific information is probably not going to be that accurate. So it might be a good idea to wait till you have 300,000 or 400,000 hands on villain before you start breaking it down by board texture or by position. Then to break it down by both at the same time, then you'd need millions of hands on your opponent. So don't waste your time analyzing stuff which is basically just a function of variance given that the sample size is not there. A very useful feature when running analysis on a specific villain is the versus hero data. And this is something that's automatically generated for every stat. So for every stat we have on the HUD, we also have a versus hero value. Now this is not going to work with the database that we currently have because no hero is defined for the database. So if there's no hero in the database, then we can't have a versus hero stat for the various players in the database. Let's just have a quick look at how it works anyway. So imagine we have this opponent. His pre-flop 3-bet 6%, but we feel that he's getting out of line against us. We have this suspicion that maybe he's adjusting against us. Maybe we fold a lot to 3-bets and we think that this particular villain is trying to exploit us. What's the easy way to check this? Well, we bring up the auto-generated pop-up and we have a look at the versus hero value. So as we can see, it's not calculated for this database. The idea is simple. We look at the overall stat value, it's 6. We look at the versus hero value. If the versus hero value is similar to the overall value, it basically means it's all in our head. Villain is not 3-betting against us more often, it just feels that way, but it's actually 3-betting against us with the same frequency as 3-betting against the population. Normally when these numbers are the same, i.e. for any stat, when the overall stat is same as the versus hero value, it's somewhat comforting to know that it basically means villain is not playing differently against us. He just has his strategy, he's using the same strategy against us. That means he either doesn't make any adjustments against anyone, or he's not aware of a specific exploit that he can use against us so far. Now, the problem occurs when we have a relevant sample size. So remember, these numbers are subject to variance as well, so make sure you've got a decent sample. When we see that the versus hero value is significantly different from the overall stat value, that means that villain is potentially exploiting us. He's recognized that we fold too much to 3-bets. He's now 3-betting more against us than he does against the population. So in that instance, we obviously don't want to use the main HUD panel value. So obviously this 6% is what it's going to say on the main panel. We don't want to use that value, we want to use the versus hero value in making our decisions. Okay, so that's villain analysis. We've just given a rough coverage of that. We'll see some more specific examples a bit later in the series. Self-analysis is very similar to villain analysis, certainly in the way that it works with hand to note. In the main hand to note window, we simply click on the screen name to bring up the pop-ups. So let's imagine this guy is villain. We just double click, it brings up the pop-ups. We want to see the main panel, we go to the open raise tab as we've discussed. Let's imagine hero is some hero. Exactly the same. Just double click, we bring up the pop-ups. So remember how we were saying earlier with different trackers that we might need to go into some kind of report system. And by the way, the same thing exists in hand to note. You simply go to reports, and there's various reports we can run, and there's filters that we can add, but it makes little sense to use this filter system aside from a few very specific situations. And those specific situations are when we want to see a graphed representation of certain spots. But aside from that, there's no point using this, because why make a whole nother tools package when we have the ability to just double click on the screen name and see, as we discussed, 400,000 plus data points on our opponent. It doesn't make sense to use filters, we're just duplicating the work there. We could spend months creating some kind of complex filter system for hand to note, but it doesn't make sense when the pop-ups already run a wide range of different filters for us automatically without us needing to do any kind of work. So obviously for self-analysis, make sure you use the larger pop-ups profile, so the main Death Star profile in the case of my HUD, so you have access to all of the information, because generally speaking, unless you have data mined hands, your screen name is going to have the largest amount of information. So whatever the highest volume villain is in your database, you're going to have more hands on yourself than you will have on that villain. So you generally want to be using the larger pop-up profile to have a larger sample size. Make use of the maps and charts with showdown information. I'll just draw your attention to one feature, which are the skipped stats. Historically, HUD configurations don't have skipped stats, and the reason is pretty straightforward. Originally, a pop-up would only display frequency information. You wouldn't have access to these additional pop-ups over the stats. So for example, if we had this stat here, flop c-bet OOP is 42. Now if I was a HUD creator, I could spend the time making a stat that says, how often does this player not c-bet the flop? But what's the point? We can just figure it out very, very straightforward. Unless we're very, very bad at arithmetic, we know that if this player c-bets 42%, he must skip his flop c-bet 58%. What's the point of having a stat for that? Now that's the old way of thinking, because if a stat is just a frequency, then let's not waste our time. Most of us can subtract 42 from 100. However, you'll notice that in the lower part of this window, we do in fact have the skip c-bet OOP stat. So why do we have this stat here? Isn't it obvious? Well, the point is the pop-up. So we can now hover over this stat, and we can see the distribution of hands that didn't fire a continuation bet on the flop. In other words, this type of feature is solely designed for self-analysis, and in some cases villain analysis. So in the context of traditional HUD, you don't need this stat here. If you just want frequency information on villain, you can ignore this, but seeing as this is essentially a multi-tools package, we have this here solely for the purpose of off-table analysis for ourselves or villain, whatever we're looking at. So now we can access all of the hands that skip the c-bet on the flop. For example, perhaps we have a strong hand, we want to figure out why this player did c-bet. So these are overpairs, for example. We can have a look at the replay. We can see an example where this player open raised but didn't fire a continuation bet with kings on a queen jack 7. Maybe we feel that that should be a c-bet there. We can open up the hand, we can run some analysis on it. Okay, finally moving on to population analysis. So we've seen exactly how this is used throughout the series so far. The goal is to develop default lines for use against the population, and obviously this is going to be the biggest sample size work we do. it's going to be the most hands because it's all the players in the database, so used with a huge sample size along with the largest pop-up profiles, the Death Star HUD in this case. So just going to take a couple of minutes to show you how you run this in Hand to Note. You will need an Edge subscription for this, so this doesn't work on every single Hand to Note subscription. You have to get the most expensive one, unfortunately, but assuming you have the Edge subscription, you go to Range Research. There are different filters you can process the range research with, and what that allows us to do is analyze a subset of the population. For example, if we just wanted to see data on weak players, we could do that. If we only wanted to see data on players with, let's say, an open limp stat of larger than 5%, it's possible to create an expression which takes into account a certain stat. It's only going to analyze players who fit the criteria. So this is an example of an expression string that I wrote. Won't talk too much about expression strings, slightly outside the scope of this video. But here's an example of an expression I wrote based on a stat. So the stat name is Weasel Open Limp. If it's larger than 5, a player gets processed for the purposes of population analysis. The basic type of range research, though, is just for all opponents with no expression string and no specification. And we simply click the Build button when we're ready. Now, in the past, I made the mistake of assuming that we had to go and create a pop-up to run analysis on. So I was doing this individually for each pop-up. What I realized is if we just click Build without specifying anything, it will build the data based around our pop-ups. Now, notice it says Rebuild here. That's because I've already built. But if you haven't built them yet, you just click the Build button. You wait a while, depends on the size of your database. And once it's processed, we go to the Result tab. And what we see in the Result tab is average data for the population. So we're not seeing specific player information now. What we're seeing is fold to CBET on average. This is how often the average player folds to a CBET. You're aware of the idea if you've seen the earlier parts of the series because much of it was based around running population analysis on various pop-ups. So in the context of that new pop-up I discussed earlier, which is going to be the turn information, you can now see how often players fold to turn CBETs on average across a population after calling a flop CBET of different sizings. Am I going to show you these values? No, I'm not going to show you right now. I'm going to be pretty awkward about it and tell you that if you want to see the information in those tabs, then you're going to have a similar configuration to mine. On that note, if you're interested in picking up the Death Star HUD, you can get it from www.pokerweasel.com/deathstar. And there's an overview video there, gives you some more information about the HUD. It's also a trial, and it's possible to purchase there as well. Not necessarily saying that you have to have the Death Star HUD, but you've seen some of the advantages of it. And it is completely possible to create your own version of all of these custom definitions. It will take you a while, but there are some benefits to that as well, which is you learn about how to code stats. It causes you to think about the various scenarios involved. It causes you to think about what the average values of various stats should be. But if you're interested in the quick version and just getting a fully configured up and running HUD for the purposes of self-analysis, fill-in analysis, range research, i.e. population analysis, then the Death Star HUD is available for purchase. Alright, that's it for this video. Thanks very much for watching. Catch you in the next part of the Expert Exploits series.